Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jackson McDonald. I am a sophomore physics major, and today I will be discussing my computational analysis of dust collisions in protoplanetary disks, research which I have conducted under Dr. Chao-Chin Yang, the University of Alabama Department of Physics and Astronomy. I will begin by covering some quick background before getting into the specifics of the model I analyzed. I will then discuss the pipeline I developed for analyzing the data from the model, and then discuss some preliminary results and interpretation. To start, we know that when a star forms, the excess gas and dust will collect into what's known as a protoplanetary disk. You can see an artist rendering on the slide before you. We see evidence of these disks, and in fact, we see these disks around other stars, and we know our own solar system had one. We also know that kilometer-sized objects can form in these protoplanetary disks. This is a photo of Ceres, which is a kilometer-sized object in our own solar system. We also know that millimeter, centimeter-sized objects can accrete up to those sizes through accretion and electrostatic forces in these disks. However, when we try to simulate dust collisions to try and get much larger than centimeter to millimeter sizes, we run into some issues. Here I have a couple videos from the Braunschweig University of Technology simulating the conditions inside a protoplanetary disk. And you can see that when we have smaller particles, especially smaller particles colliding with larger particles at lower speeds, we can get some mass transfer, some growing particles. You see that the smaller particle attached a little bit of itself to the larger particle, allowing that larger particle to grow a little bit. However, when we increase the size of the particles, and especially when we increase the speed of the particles, we tend to get bouncing or fragmentation collisions, where particles will blow each other apart. And that leads to a bit of an issue, because we know that kilometer-sized objects exist. We're standing on one right now. They had to form somehow. So we need to find some way around these barriers in order to form those kilometer-sized objects. And that is where the models come in, bringing us to our next section. This is one of Dr. Yang's models, based off of an original model from Johansen and Uden, that is a two-dimensional subsection of a protoplanetary disk, with the z direction being the vertical direction from the disk, and the x direction being radially outward from the center, the protostar. There's no y direction in this model. We're not simulating the tangential direction for computational simplicity. Also, take note that all the units here are generalized to the disks. They're dependent on location of the disk. For example, all of our distances are in terms of the local scale height, which is the height by which the density of the gas decreases by a factor of E. And that is dependent on the location of the disk. Similarly, time is measured in local orbital period, also dependent on the location of the disk. We can see when we run this model that it quickly develops from a fairly uniform state to a very turbulent flow. And these dense filaments develop, these yellow-green sections you see on the screen. And these filaments are what we're interested in to try and be able to form planetesimals and planets. Notably, this model relies on a few key assumptions. Most notably, these aren't actually particles, but instead superparticles, which are cloud-like representations of the actual particles we would see within. Also, we're assuming all the dust particles are identical, they're spherical, uniform, and all the same size. And of course, we're not simulating the y direction. This likely has implications on our results, but for now, we have them in place for computational simplicity to be able to simulate this on a human timescale with any machine that exists. I then took the data from this model and ran it through my analysis pipeline to convert it into interpretable graphs. I started with the particle data for about 200,000 superparticles, namely the position and the velocity, and calculated a few important parameters for every pair of particles in the model, comparing every particle to every other particle, which is about 34 billion pairs. The parameters I calculated are collision speed, in this case, just the relative velocity, the distance between two particles, and the impact parameter, which is how close two particles will get. I then took these parameters and produced 2D histograms with them of collision speed versus distance and collision speed versus impact parameter. Notably, I also threw a filter in here to throw out all of the cases where the particles are moving away from each other, because those likely won't interact with each other on timescales short enough that are relevant to our analysis. And we also have a variable to decide how close, what the maximum distance between particles we want to graph is, again, because those close particles are the ones that are interacting with those collision speeds that we calculated before. And from here, we can make some interpretations using these graphs, bringing us to our final section. This is a graph of collision speed versus distance. And if we zoom in a little bit, we can see that the collision speed is in terms of the local speed of sound, and the distance is in terms of the local scale height, both units dependent on the location within the disk. This is notably from a snapshot taken. Particles won't tend to fragment or bounce off of each other if they don't have the collision speeds to fragment or bounce off of each other. And in fact, when we look at the impact parameter, we see the same lack of particles. Remember, the impact parameter is how close two particles will get. And the fact that we see this in the impact parameter space is important, because not only do particles that are very close have low collision speeds, but particles that are going to be very close have those same low collision speeds, again, lending credence to our theory. Notably, we've still got some work to do to finalize this analysis and solidify our results. First thing I want to do is add a local dust density parameter, look at the density around the pair of particles, the dust density around the pair of particles, to see if these low collision speeds are in those filamentary sections of the disk. Notably, this also requires some more optimization to be able to run on reasonable timescales. I also want to quantify the relationships between collision velocity distance and collision velocity and impact parameter, likely with something along the lines of a linear regression. I would also like to run this pipeline over a full model run and determine if we see this lack of high-speed close particles across the whole model run, or if that varies with time, and hopefully quantify if it does. And then I would like to run this pipeline over a few different models to see how this relationship changes with different resolutions and more dimensions, see if our assumptions that we made in the model are reasonable assumptions to make. Are there any questions from the audience?
So you just mentioned you're going to add the local dust density parameter there. Do you have any intuition on what that will do? What are you expecting to see from that, just from your initial thoughts?
Likely we would see what we are expecting, that those close particles with low collision speeds are those ones in those densest filaments. So the higher the dust density, the lower the collision speed, and the lower the distance.
When you're discussing future work, you talk about the need to continue implementing an optimization algorithm. This is really interesting because you've got a lot of different objects you're simulating, and from how complex your model is, my best guess is that takes a lot of time and computational power to run. How are you currently optimizing it, given that those two things generally make optimization extremely difficult?
Currently, the optimization we have done so far is to vectorize our data when it is passed through the functions that calculate the important parameters that we're looking at. We want to continue doing that, continue refining that process, and improve the hardware we're working with, hopefully by using the UA high HPC and potentially some NASA supercomputers.
You mentioned that the model develops into a turbulent state because of interactions between dust and gas particles. Could you talk a little more on what those interactions are?
Yes, of course. The primary interaction between the gas and dust particles, if we go back to our model here, is normal air resistance. It's actually friction between the dust particles and the gas particles. This is because the dust particles are orbiting at different speeds than the gas particles. The reason for this is the gas particles, or the orbital speed of a particle, is dependent on its net centripetal force, that force pulling it inwards towards the star. And the gas exerts outward pressure on other gas molecules, canceling out a little bit of that gravity from the center of the disk, meaning it has less centripetal force and a slightly lower velocity than the dust particles, meaning that there's some differential in velocity, causing a little bit of friction, causing some air resistance. And that actually results in another barrier that I didn't really have time to get into in this presentation, the radial drift barrier, where those dust particles, because of that friction, will tend to spiral inward, potentially messing with our system of these particles growing into larger kilometer scale objects.
On the zoomed out collision speed versus distance graph, the highest concentration of particle pairs was at relatively high collision speeds and distances. What's the reason for that concentration, and what implication does it have on your conclusions?
Astute observation. This, as you can see on this zoomed out graph, this larger graph, the highest concentrations of particles are not actually in that lower left-hand corner, but at much higher distances and much higher collision speeds. However, these particles aren't super relevant to our analysis, primarily because they're just too far away. And by the time they would interact with each other, their collision speeds would almost certainly have changed. So again, it's not really relevant.